Hi, good morning. Well, it won't be long. Won't be long. All right, good to see everybody this morning. Thanks for being here. We're going to continue on with our look at Samuel. I hate to say this because it may scare some people off, but there didn't seem like there was much time between the early service and class, and I think the preacher went long. So you got to watch that guy. All right, continue on with 1 Samuel. We're going to hope to cover quite a bit of ground. The way that we're kind of working our way through this is in large sections and things that have a lot of things in common. And chapters 18 through 20 have quite a bit, and that's what I want to try to cover this morning. We may not get all of it done, but we'll give it a go. We ended last week with, of course, an incredibly familiar, probably the most familiar of the events in the books of Samuel. There's another one that's coming that we know fairly well, but probably none that gets talked about any more than David and Goliath. We just ended that. We get to see what it looks like, just kind of like almost polar opposites of Saul and David. And we have those who are just, we have Saul who is absolutely dependent on what he sees right in front of him, and David who is dependent on God and says, that God can handle this. It's a wonderful, wonderful narrative, but it's going to lead to some trouble for David, okay, which shouldn't shock us because we've spent some time with Saul. So we're going to learn some more about him in just a second. At the end of the narrative, at the end of David's killing of Goliath, Saul begins to question, okay, who exactly is this kid? Right? And not just who is he, but I want him with me. So David's going to become a permanent fixture in the ruling of Saul and kind of his administration. And that's where we're going to pick up in chapter 18. I want us to start because this is going to come into play throughout the rest of both books. And this is the first 5 verses of chapter 18. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, which that's David, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor, even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also good in the sight of Saul's servants. There's be more made of this as we make our way through, but we get this, the friendship of Jonathan and David. There's a draw there somehow. But we're going to see Jonathan making a covenant with David. We're going to see the son of the king befriending what the king will see as his greatest enemy, and how that plays out throughout this section and even beyond. Okay. All right, so let's go on. I want to go ahead and get to this. We got a lot of ground to cover. All right, verse 6. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry. This saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul. He raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall, but David evaded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. He went out and came in before the people. David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. We see Saul's trouble, don't we? And it's so easy to see the trouble or the faults in other people, right? I mean, can we be honest? I mean, it's easy. But it hits a little close to home, or it certainly can. We get to see, again, the failings of Saul as king. All right? We understand, right, because we've already been through the narrative where Samuel has told him, nope, you're not doing this. I mean, this is it. The kingdom is lost to you, and God will bring someone else. At this point, I don't know whether Saul recognizes who that someone else is. But we see a major failing on the part of Saul. Okay? We can just say it. That's what it is. Saul's focus is not where it's supposed to be. Saul's focus is not necessarily the good of the people of Israel. Saul's focus is on the good for Saul. Right? He has brought in this young man who has done something that no one else in Israel was willing to do. Right? None of them, all of the army of Israel stands and says, no thank you, right, when Goliath shows up. But it's David who goes out and takes care of the problem. David understanding that there's nothing that God can't do, and it's a wonderful, wonderful narrative, right? We've been through it. But he is able to do what the king was unwilling to do. Right? Saul was not going to go out there. But David does. And so as he sees the success of David, he does what any smart leader would do. I want him on my team. Right? Right? Because this is a good thing. But whenever it comes down to, is it good for Israel versus is it good for Saul, Saul's going to choose Saul. The women come out and they dance and they sing, Saul has killed his thousands. That's pretty good. Right? They didn't say what the rest of us are probably thinking after we've read the story with David and Goliath. Saul hid in his tent. No, they didn't say that, right? Saul has taken care of his thousands and David his 10,000s. It's good for Israel as they fight against the Philistines. But Saul doesn't see that. All he sees is it's bad for Saul. It's bad for Saul. What else can he have except the kingdom? We've seen this with Saul so far, and it is going to continue on. He is undone, right? Saul is undone by his own hand. Okay? We can look at that. We can look at those passages that says, the Spirit of God left Saul and God sent a harmful spirit. And we can say, look, God's behind this. But that doesn't happen until Saul says, It's all about me. His own disobedience in offering a sacrifice when he's not supposed to, his own disobedience in not taking care of the Amalekites like he's supposed to. And now, in a move that I think is largely political, although I do believe it's smart, he brings into his administration the very person that's going to take his place. And he is undone by his own hand. And that's the way most of us become undone. Okay? Things happen. There's no doubt about that. Things happen. We may say we've had a run of bad luck, however we want to phrase it. But circumstances have not necessarily been in our favor, maybe. But when we shake everything out and we begin to look at what's the problem here, usually it's looking at us in the mirror. That we become undone by our own hand. And that's a hard pill to swallow. Isn't it? Or was I the only one that choked on that? Right? That as much as we would like to, point those fingers at everything else, often it comes right back to, and here's where I did it. We are, and I'm sure that you've noticed this, we're in a current situation as far as culture around us that assumes no responsibility for anything. Okay, now that's an overstatement, but it's a good one. But often, right? Often, it's not me. It's something else. It's not my fault. It's this, and we could go through the list, and there's really no point in doing that. What we see is as time marches on, some things are just always the same. God said, "Did you eat from the tree that I told you not to?" And Adam said, "It's your fault." He didn't say it that way, right? But the woman that you gave me is what he says, right? It's really her fault. And if you want to just get right down to it, God, it's your fault because you put her here. And then Eve goes, "Ooh, no, not me. It's the serpent." Right? And some things never change. And I think because that's easy, okay? Right? And it's easy. Because if I can blame you, then I don't have to change anything. Right? Do we ever hear that? We hear that in any conflicts that we ever are in the middle of? It's not really my problem, it's theirs. And if they just get their act together, then I would be okay. Huh? If people would just act like I think they ought to, then I wouldn't have to get angry. Right? I wouldn't have to sin. I wouldn't have to talk bad about them. And maybe the trouble's me. But we don't like to admit that, and neither does Saul. He will go to great lengths not to admit this, including a guy that he just brought into his administration, he'll try to kill. Huh? Here we go. Let's keep moving. Verse 17. Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter, Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. And David said to Saul, who am I, and who are my relatives in my father's clan in Israel, that I should be the son-in-law to the king? But at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Mahalathite for wife. Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you. All his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spoke these words in the ears of David. And David says, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? The servants of Saul told him, thus and so did David speak. Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. But when Saul knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. The commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. We'll get to this later, and we'll hit this a little bit harder later. But we see Saul's thinking, right? He's tried to kill David, well, at least twice here, and he'll try again. And then he goes, okay, maybe it's best if I don't do it. But I can arrange things so that it happens. The Philistines can do it for me. It doesn't work for him, right? But here's a lesson I think David learns early in Saul's reign that David will use later. Okay? But again, we see Saul's trouble. As he first approaches David about being his son-in-law, which is, by the way, what he had promised to whoever killed Goliath. And so he seems to be making good on that. David kind of stands back a little, and I'm a little confused by that, but I think it makes a little more sense as the narrative progresses. I'm a little confused by that because, again, David knew that this was the kind of the prize for the fight. I believe he asked this 3 times before he went out to Goliath to go, is this what the king has said? Okay. But when it happens, David says, I'm not sure, right? This is no little thing to be the son-in-law of the king. And so I am a bit confused by that, but Saul seems to withdraw that offer, and we really don't, it's not really given to us why that happens. But then there's the other daughter. The other daughter who loves David. And Saul sees an opportunity. Okay? That maybe he can work it, through his daughter to get rid of David. But David again goes, right, this is no little thing to be the son-in-law of the king, and here's where I think we get to what David's problem was. I'm poor. There's got to be a bride price. I mean, that's the way it was done. They didn't have anything. And I don't know. It's dangerous to try to get in somebody else's head, especially somebody that from this kind of distance. But it could be, and as we think about it maybe even a little closer to home of going, I don't want to start off being indebted to the king. Right? For him to have that of going, kind of an indebted thing. And so, again, Saul sees an opportunity. What I'll ask for is 100 foreskins of the Philistines. If he can do that without getting killed, then we'll go with this. I think his thought is, and we see it in the narrative, going, this will never happen. I mean, come on, that's not going to happen. And so he not only gets 100, he gets 2. The problem that we see, the other problem that we see in Saul's life here is that those that he believes to be closest and loyal to him are not. His son Jonathan, who at this point, my guess is, and that's all I've got to guess, who at this point is actually in line for the throne. Right? As far as he knows. And maybe as far as Saul is thinking, that he doesn't seem to pay a lot of attention to God to start with, and maybe he's going, well, we'll just keep on going, even though God said your kingdom is at an end. That he thinks with that, surely Jonathan is kind of his right hand here. Sorry, I've got the wrong one out. His right hand here. But Jonathan loves David as he loves himself, it says. There's a friendship, there's a bond there that Saul didn't expect. In marrying David, or marrying one of his daughters off to David, I believe Saul to think he has an in. He has some more control. He maybe has another way in to getting rid of David, only to find out that his daughter loves David far more, it seems, than she loves Saul. I don't know what this draw is. I really don't. I mean, there's several things, to admire about David, especially early on, and maybe that's it. But it could be that there's something that they recognize, something that they're seeing that Saul's not seeing, and it gets repeated over and over, just in little passing comments along the way, that the Lord is with David, and somehow or another, and it doesn't really tell us. Somehow or another, they recognize this. And that there's something about David that's a draw to them. Okay? All right. So, Saul's going to try again, chapter 19. Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David, but Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father seeks to kill you, therefore be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. I will go out, stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you, and if I learn anything, I'll tell you. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and he said to him, let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. For he took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine, and the Lord worked a great salvation for Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And Jonathan called David and reported to him all these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. So far, so good. Then there was war again. David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a great blow, so that they fled before him. A harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul, and as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the lyre, Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall. David fled and escaped that night. Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, if you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. Michal let David down through the window. He fled away and escaped. Michal took an image and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered it with the clothes. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. Saul sent messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed, that I may kill him. And when the messengers came in, behold, the image was in bed, with a pillow of goat's hair at his head. Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me, and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? Another bit of an excuse there. We don't have anything that David said he's going to kill her if he doesn't get out of there. But it's a faith-saving thing. But we see again, both Jonathan and Michal love David far more than they do Saul, or they're going to be loyal to David. Here's a weird one. David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah, and he told him all that Saul had done to him. And Samuel went and lived at Naioth, and it was told to Saul, behold, David is at Naioth and Ramah. And then Saul sent messengers to take David. When they saw the company of prophets prophesying and Samuel standing as head over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. When it was told to Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. And Saul sent messengers again a third time, and they also prophesied. Then he went to Ramah and came to the great well that is in Seku, and asked, where are Samuel and David? And one said, behold, they are in Naioth and Ramah. And he went, and the Spirit of God came upon him also, and he went and prophesied until he came to Naioth at Ramah. And he too stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay naked all that day and all that night. Thus it is said, is Saul also among the prophets. In case we haven't figured it out, the Lord is with David. And so as David goes and he seeks Samuel to tell him what all Saul has been up to, they leave, go to another town, and then Saul sends messengers after messengers after messengers, and they can't get there because they are overcome with the Spirit of God on the way. I don't know exactly what that means, okay? I don't mind telling you. It's confusing to me. But I find it really interesting that Saul does this too. That when Saul goes himself, that this happens to him. I would like to think, if we're trying to give Saul the benefit of the doubt here, or at least go, kind of tap him on the shoulder a little bit, to go, do you remember when this happened before? When God anointed you as king? And he said that, and Samuel had told you that you're going to see these prophets going up to sacrifice. And the Spirit of God is going to come over you, and you are going to be a different person. If this didn't ring any bells with Saul? Another way to look at this might be, again, I'm telling you, I don't get all this, and I don't mind telling you that. Is that another thing that we get to see here is that Saul's refusal to humble himself before God doesn't work eventually. That when he comes into the presence of the Spirit of God, that he is humbled. I think maybe that's why we have that he lay naked all day and all night before the prophets, before Samuel. It's a humiliating gesture. Okay? And I don't know this. I just, as I try to think through and way that this parallels, and the story gets told again, because right, the main stories of Scripture get told over and over in different ways, right? There's a big overarching narrative of God wanting to be with his people, God looking for people who will humble themselves and be his people, right? And being with him in that way. And then what happens to those who refuse? And as I read this, there was a passage that kind of came to my mind from the New Testament. And it's a pretty familiar one when we stop and think about it. And it's Philippians chapter 2. Right? About Jesus who, although he existed in the form of God, humbled himself. Right? Many believe it's a part of an old Christian hymn that Paul recites here. It's a kind of a hymn that they were using at the time. I don't know if that's true or not. Sounds reasonable. But it just kind of tells the story of Jesus who humbles himself before God, because Paul's just got through talking about how they are to humble themselves with one another, serve one another, right, to be the people of God. And at the end of that, he said that he has given him a name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth. And every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. That's how that ends. And we get to see a little bit of that in the life of Saul here, of going, you can humble yourself now, but you will humble yourself at some point. You will be humbled at some point. I think far too often, far too often in my life I've seen those traits of Saul come up. Right? Can I just say that? Right? Where all of a sudden things become more about me than about other things, and I'm sure nobody else has that problem, but I've had that problem. I don't mind telling you. Right? I've had it. But passages like this are one of those things that I hope kind of stick with us. That humbling ourselves before God, or being humbled before God, is not optional. Okay? Are you with me? It's not optional. Now, either we can do that voluntarily, right? As we recognize who he is and we recognize the things that he's asking us to do, we can do that voluntarily, or at some point we will do that no matter what. Now, it seems to me far better to do that voluntarily. Would you agree with that? Okay. Because if we think about this, through the life of Saul, it doesn't end well for him. No more than it will end well for us if we don't do that. That make sense? All right? And I think, and again, there's a lot of weirdness here with this. Okay, I don't mind telling you, this just seems strange to me. But I believe that the author is trying to get that across. We started, okay, we got some time. We started, as we looked at the introduction to this book, as far as the time in which the time that this is written. Right? And I think there's a difference. I don't, and you can disagree with that, and that's okay. I think there's a difference between the time the events occur to the time it's written down. Okay? I think a lot of these narratives, a lot of these things are told in Israel before they're written down. And maybe I'm overreading it, wouldn't be the first time, but back in chapter 18 and verse 16, is one of those places that confuses me just a little as we start thinking about the timing of when this is written down. Okay? And it seems small, and so maybe I am overdoing it, right? But it says, but all Israel and Judah loved David. There is no Israel and Judah here during the time of when these happen. This is not the divided kingdom yet. And so I think some of these things are recorded, and please don't get me wrong. I don't think they're making this stuff up, okay? But I think these things are recorded with a purpose in mind, that the people who read that are reminded that if we'll humble ourselves before God voluntarily, then he won't do it for us. And this seems to happen, if I'm right, which, again, that's a huge if. That if this is written around the time of the divided kingdom, before Israel is gone, right? Because at some point, Israel is gone. Those 10 northern tribes. That maybe this is also to help serve as a warning to the people of Israel and Judah in the divided kingdoms. You can either humble yourself before God or he'll do it for you. They don't seem to get the message because we do have the Assyrian captivity and then we have the Babylonian one. Which again, I think, at least in my mind, is maybe the reason we've got this. This is just another reminder of we can do this voluntarily or God will do it for us. And I think we're much better off voluntarily. All right, here we go. We got a little bit of time. We're not gonna make it, but we're gonna get close. Here we go. Forgot where I was. Chapter 20. And David fled, came before Jonathan, and said, "What have I done? What's my guilt? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" And he said to him, "Far from it. You shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so." But David vowed again, "Your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes, and he thinks, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives and your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death." And Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you say, I'll do for you." And David said to Jonathan, "Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit at table with the king. But let me go that I may hide myself in the field till the third day at evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, for there's a yearly sacrifice there for all the clan. And if he says, good, it will be well with your servant, but if he is angry, then know that harm is determined by him. Therefore deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there is guilt in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father?" And Jonathan said, "Far be it from you. If I knew that it was determined by my father that harm should come to you, would I not tell you?" And then David said to Jonathan, "And who will tell me if your father answers roughly?" And Jonathan said to David, "Come, let us go out into the field." And they both went out into the field. Okay, you guys can read this. We'll just kind of talk through it really quickly. Jonathan has still taken Saul at his word from when he talked to him before. And Saul said, "Oh, no, you're right. I won't do that. I won't try to kill him." And he continues on. Another one of the failings. We can just keep adding those to the column, but we see them. So David devises a way to find out. To not show up at the new moon feast would be kind of an affront to the king. He's part of the administration. He's part of the family. And so if he doesn't show up, his absence is going to be noticed. Right? He's got a special place. He says, let me do this for at least 3 days, right? Till the third day. I'm going to skip it until the third day. So when the first day happens, Saul thinks to himself, David's not here because he's unclean in some way. And we can go back and look at the cleanliness laws or the things that have happened, and you can't participate if you've done certain things. But there's usually like a day of cleansing, and then you're back. You can come back. The second day, he begins to miss him. He begins to miss him. And when he says, I told him it was fine for him to go back home, Saul has a fit. And Jonathan understands what's going on. They've devised this plan that David is to go into the field. Jonathan is to get him word by, it's kind of odd, but it's not like you pick up your cell phone, so he's got to do something. So I'm gonna shoot arrows, and I'm gonna have a boy run to get the arrows. And if I say that the arrow is beyond, right? If it's on out there a little ways, that's the signal to run. Right? If I say it's back this way, then you're safe to come back. It's a pretty good plan, right? It works because once he finds out and once he understands that Saul is going to try to kill David again, he takes the boy out there to shag arrows for him, right? And he shoots it out there and he goes, no, it's beyond. And David knows immediately what's happening. He sends the boy back into the city with the equipment, right, with his bow and his arrows and all that stuff, and sends him back. And then he and David have this exchange. As soon as the boy had gone, David rose from beside the stone heap and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. They kissed one another and wept with one another, David weeping the most. Jonathan said to David, go in peace, because we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever. He arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. That's why I wonder how difficult that is. And maybe some of us know better than others. I don't, but you kind of wonder how difficult that is for Jonathan to realize that what the king has told him, what his father has told him, is just words. But they have made an agreement between the two of them, David and Jonathan, and which will carry on between their offspring. That Jonathan will work to protect, and David will work to look out for the offspring of Jonathan. This will come into play later on. We'll hear this again as it comes back up. Well, we're going to close out this morning with this. And it's just things that we've hit on already, we just kind of want to be reminded of. That a decision that we make to fight against, that to fight against God and what He's asked of us is not going to end well. Okay? Again, that's one of those things we know. Right? We know that intellectually. The problem is often that when faced in those situations, we don't always get that right. Okay, can I say that? Okay, it's just me. All right, I don't always get that right. I keep projecting all my weaknesses on you, and that's not fair. Right? But that most of the time, actually, let's strike that. Now, we'll go with most of the time. I'm sure there are exceptions. I just don't know what they are. We are undone by our own hand. The things that, the trouble that we find, in which we find ourselves often, is because we started down the wrong path. Okay? But we can continually humble ourselves before God. Nothing is said in this that I've come across yet, and maybe we'll find it. But I just have this belief in me that early on Saul could have made a change. Right? Maybe it's at the first, right? Maybe it was learning from his mistake at the first when he offered the sacrifice he's not supposed to. Maybe that was it. But there came a point where Saul's decision was always going to be opposite of what God wanted. Whew. Okay, we're almost done, I promise. And God lets that happen. And I think we see the reasoning behind it. right? That God wants people that will recognize who He is, will humble themselves, will love Him and obey Him. That's what God's after. We see the reason. We also, I hope that it's one of those things that as we continue to face troubles that we face, or to at least face the trouble or the temptation to give in, that there comes a point when God just goes, okay, that's fine. And that's kind of scary. But what we see is the difference between saying, okay, we're going to do what you ask us to do. We're going to humble ourselves before you now. Because I think that would be preferable to having Him humble us. Let's have a prayer. Father, we thank you for our time together this morning, and we thank you so much for who you are. We confess the difficulties that we have and the failings that we have. And as we examine them, we understand it's because of choices that we've made, and we're thankful for your mercy and grace that allows us to be cleansed of that. We ask that you be with us as we live as your people, and as we humble ourselves before you, knowing that you have our best interest and your glory at heart. Thanks so much, Father, for our time together and for the things that you've left us to find. We love you so much. In Jesus' name, amen.